Hello. In this lecture, I will talk about time travel, which is, of course, an interesting and important concept for this course, which is about play, games, and past and time. Let me start with actually giving a bit of context, not necessarily only in the realm of games. Time travel has been a popular trope always, and it can especially be observed as something which triggers the imagination in science fiction stories like Jules Verne traveling underneath the sea, but also in many science fiction films and pulp magazines, as you see one from the 30s on the left side of this slide, amazing stories of an eye actually which encompasses all times and the evolution, etc. But in those pulp magazines, but also in books, a lot of imagination is concerned with traveling in time and asking what could happen when you travel back in time. Also, TV series like Doctor Who are very much occupied with the same theme. And indeed, as a new sort of sibling in this sort of cross-sectional subgenre, games have come in. And in games, time travel can take many shapes and forms as well. It can be just simply, you could say, if a game is set in another time and age, as the like Civilization, for example, that's a kind of time travel. But it can also be that you can move to other times through a game, for example, in Skyrim through the time runes. And mostly what occupies us when we engage with time traveling and why it's so exciting, I would say, is the question, what if? What if another path was taken? What if I would have been my ancient grandfather? How would I have changed maybe things which would have taken effect in the future? Of course, an example which should be named here as well is Assassin's Creed's Animus, in which you, through your DNA and the memory in that, you can enter the sort of the lives of your predecessors, of very much, again, like many, often with time traveling, also seeking a combination of science and fiction and playing with things which are possible now in our modern world, technology-wise, namely DNA in this case, and warping them or playing with them in a fictional environment. So, as I said already, time travel is often or is about the what if. What if I could come back? What if I could go back to when my mother, when I was born, for example? What could I have changed? And when you look at the whole discourse of time travel, actually it's very intriguing because in a way, of course, if you go back to change your youth, it won't be the same youth anymore, and you won't be the same you anymore in the present. So time traveling often deals with this totally, very complex and paradoxical relation, and also a very Western notion, I would say, partly, between future, past, and present, which in Western culture is often seen as a linear process instead of a cyclical one. And in time travel stories, those sort of temporal realms start to hybridize and affect each other. That's not only a question, as I also already mentioned in another lecture, time and space are always very intertwined, actually. In science fiction stories, but also in games, that's not only a question of time, but also a question of space. Indeed, the word travel gives it away already. Through travel, through moving through space, you do get into another time. So again, you may remember Espen Aarseth's book about allegories of space I mentioned in an earlier lecture. the thing that through space and moving forward in space, um, temporal relations are created is very much clear when we talk about time travel. And then, indeed, what if another choice was made is pivotal in those stories often. What if another path was chosen? That brings me to a particular kind of time travel, you could say, namely interactive storytelling. Interactive storytelling is very much about which path leads to another outcome. Often related to the idea of interactive storytelling, which really started to become an important thing, I would say, with the advent of computers in the 90s already of the last century. Often equated with that is the Garden of the Forking Paths, which was written by Borges, is in which the labyrinth or the forking paths are seen as a metaphor in which you can take a choice which leads to another outcome in the future. And although this is, of course, future driven, it still is about this question of the what if. So often, computers on the whole, and not only computer games, are seen as a sort of garden of the forking paths in which certain routes are taken and you make choices the whole time. Do I click on this link? Do I click on that link, for example? And as such, the Garden of the Forking Paths is not only a good metaphor to understand how time travel works, forward time travel indeed, in games, but it also is a good metaphor to think about the internet and computer ways of thinking or logic on the whole. Interactive storytelling means different things in different fields, as my last pointer here says. But sort of in a nutshell, you can say that again, it is about this what if question, which is so central to how I already introduced time travel. Choices are made and lead to different outcomes, exactly as in the story of Borges. But then at the same time, and that makes it so intriguing, and that's why we also are going to make a twine to think and reflect, think about that and reflect on it. Other possibilities still seem to exist, sometimes in computer games as well, but in Twine as well, those possibilities may not be there, but you have the feeling that you could have taken other routes which would have led to other outcomes. And also interactive is not only about the interactive choices you make, but also about the interaction with other actors. And other actors can mean other players, but they can also mean, of course, technologies, AI, and algorithms, to name a few. So interactive storytelling is about the Garden of the Forking Paths and is in that way a time machine, one could say. A nice, I think I mentioned this maybe before in a lecture, a nice BC, before computer example of this is the Cave of Time, in which a book actually can also give you that choice of an adventure, turning or going to a different page. So again, like with the time traveling as a whole, it's a cultural trope which may have specific sort of manifestations at this time and age, but is in itself not a new, you could almost say, fascination people have with how different things could have looked if they had made different choices. It's almost in that way an existential exercise, to speak with Sartre. Right. So in a nutshell, one could say in interactive storytelling, the storyline is not predetermined. It's often digitally enhanced or facilitated. Content adapts to one's choices. And as a sort of author, designer, you have a different role than only being the narrator, but you also give the narration partly to the player who becomes involved in narrating a story depending on which path is taken. So a different role for the reader player it involves as well. So one could ask certain things about interactive storytelling. Is it rule bound, for example, or can it be more free, like more a sort of, like in Minecraft, where you can choose not necessarily different paths, but make different paths yourself? And also, how infinite are the choices also in interactive storytelling? As you will see hands-on or experience hands-on when you make a twine, it may seem infinite, but you do often limit the amount of choices. And also, when you take a different path, that can lead to a choice you could have taken earlier in the twine as well. Also, with what are we interacting in these interactive storytelling is an interesting question. I mentioned AI, I mentioned other players, but it's an interesting point for analysis as well. And then one could also question, is Assassin's Creed's animus maybe a kind of interactive storytelling device as well? Anyhow, and that's probably why it is old and new at the same time, it signals a move from telling to moving stories. And of course, if we look at other cultures, like for example the Aboriginals in Australia, but also oral cultures in which stories are told by travelers who arrive in a village, this is not a new thing, but it has given a new shape in our digital times. So the thing is, again, linking it to the time machine, it's not about telling something which has taken place, but you tell through movement. And that movement is both temporal and spatial, I would say. But it's anyway hardly very personal, because it feels very personal, because it is the choices you make as a player, narrator, reader. And those all come or lead to different outcomes. At least that's how you imagine it, and that's the sort of what makes people want to play these interactive narratives. I very briefly want to introduce a thinker who may be very helpful when we think about this moving through time. And that's the French philosopher Michel de Certeau. And he wrote a lot of stuff, and it's very complex often what he wrote. But one thing is an interesting way to think about spatial stories. So the stories which play out in a space, and you could go to the right, you could go to the left, for example. And in his work, which he wrote before the digital became a main part of our culture, he makes a difference between two ways in which we are confronted with space. And one is a very static way in which we understand space, which is objective, like a map, which is scientific, like figures, for example, as well, abstract and fixed. So that's the map you use, for example, to find your way through a city, a paper map, for example. On the other hand, how we also experience place indeed, he calls that place, and space the abstract one, is through moving. And he observed that when people move through their apartment, for example, they don't do that, of course, in those abstract fixed terms. It's about describing where you go and what you see. So you come into the door and you see the toilet on the left side. And often when in countries like India, where people don't use maps, and actually it's not very mappable yet, people also, when you want to ask the way, people say you go to the end of the street and then ask someone else. So that kind of experience of space, which we are talking about here in computer games and play, is far more subjective. It is about how it feels to go through Venice is a good example where you can hardly use the map. It's the subjective experience. It's personal, and it's in that sense concrete. But it's also highly dynamic. It's about a story which develops through moving. And that's exactly the link with spatial interactive storytelling, but also with time machines, that through moving you create a story and not through looking at something static. So that brings us, of course, back, as I mentioned already, to Arset's notion of computer games, where you move through you don't have a fixed narrative, but you have a space through which you move, and through that you make a storyline for yourself in your head. So I don't know if you can see this properly, I can't, but remember the first lecture in which I talked about Frasca, who makes a difference between narratives in literature which are about the past. You read what has happened. And then he compares that with drama or theatre, which happens at the moment, so is about the now. And then computer games, which are about simulations, which are about the future. So that's a very interesting thought to combine with this whole idea of how time travel specifically plays out in computer games. I put some pictures here to make you understand what simulation is about. It's a doll's house and little things, of course, within the kind of parameters of a game or whatever it is. You can rearrange in different things, and through that create different stories. So the fascination with in that future-driven story, which computer games are, that spatial story which develops while you are moving through a game, that can sort of instilled in that can be still an idea about what it would be to travel to the past. Again, this paradox, past, present, future, manifests itself here. Also, what's important to understand, and actually that's why I started this lecture also with this idea that it's a very important cultural trope which is not specific to computer games, is that this kind of spatial storytelling is different from maybe other kinds of storytelling. It's very much bound up with popular culture, in which different which are not necessarily complex storylines in themselves, but you compile different tropes and different ideas about that story in your head. So space, as Henry Jenkins says about transmedia storytelling, you combine different ideas you got from different media and you make them into a story yourself. So space, as Jenkins says, is the first entrance to understand narrative in games. It's about discovering, controlling, and the cartography of space. And we will come back later to this in our lecture about post-colonial games as well. It's about conquering space. And that conquering of space can take place in the past, as it is the case in games like Civilization, indeed. And that fits into a bigger tradition of the Odyssey, the Quest, and Travelogues, which goes back far before computer games, but which we all know a bit about, and we fill in when it taps into the same kind of imagination as those stories. So we're talking here very much about popular culture. In way, maybe not so much, it may not be that much about complex character development and plot lines, but we construct them ourselves consciously or subconsciously through, for example, fan fiction, but also links we make or lateral thinking we do, in which we see those links between those different traditions, popular traditions. So, to conclude, time travel is As you may have noticed in this lecture, something which has very, very different meanings in different settings and has a lot of different manifestations in different times, in different cultures, etc. But what is very clear is that it's part of popular culture. This idea of what if, and the if already gives a sort of it opens up a whole big realm of imagination. Time travel is about space and time at the same time, as the two words combined already indicate. It is actually, and that's why I also talked about more than only games here, all time travel in a way is about playing with time. We could also see, and that would be interesting to explore further in your twine as well, that it brings new affordances. Digital games bring new affordances to how time travel can manifest itself, because we have now the possibility to travel different routes to different times and to different pasts. And of course, they are far more limited than what we want to believe or what the developer wants us to believe. But still, this idea that we can explore more than one timeline is very much pronounced since the advent of digital games. And what's very important to remember as well, that time travel is about travel, but through that travel, we make spatial stories, as the certo would call them. And those spatial stories are narrations, are narratives, but not in the classical sense of how many literature theories understand narratives. Thank you very much.